Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2025, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address one of the most serious issues of our time, the risk of conflict with nuclear weapons. It is a threat that challenges our conscience. It is a threat not just for Americans, but for all humanity. And it is a threat not just to humans, but to all species of life on our planet. We raise this issue in the context of a series of important anniversaries. 1 week ago, July 16th, marked the 80th anniversary of the Trinity test, the first detonation of a nuclear weapon in New Mexico. We still live with the legacy of above-ground nuclear tests. 2 years ago, the Defense Department awarded the Atomic Veterans Commemorative Service Medal to the still surviving veterans of that era and their family members. We must also honor the downwinders, civilians whose health and land suffered from the effects from radiation from these tests. Many were in the state of Nevada. In addition, we cannot forget the Pacific Islanders who have not been able to return to their home islands. Or the Uyghurs and others whose homeland in Xinjiang was the location of China's nuclear tests. They too have suffered a long-term health consequence. In 2 weeks, we will commemorate the first use of a nuclear weapon in a conflict, and that was the atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and the second, the bombing of Nagasaki, on August 9th. Let us pray that Nagasaki will be the last. Let us work to make sure that it is. Sadly, the threat from nuclear weapons is only increasing. There are estimated to be 13,400 nuclear weapons in the world today. Some 90% of these are in the arsenals of the United States and Russia. The rest belong to the UK, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. Russia has threatened to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine and even against NATO nations. North Korea uses its nuclear weapons program to intimidate the United States, Japan, and Korea. China continues to build up its nuclear arsenal. It has some 600 warheads today and is expected to pass 1,000 by 2030, according to the Pentagon. The question of Iran's nuclear program has been at the top of our concerns. The military strikes by Israel and the United States were, as stated, designed to degrade or eliminate Iran's nuclear development capabilities. However, as the Washington Post reported last week, U.S. intelligence agencies assessed that only one of Iran's 3 principal nuclear facilities was destroyed by the U.S. attacks. This tells us that military action is not a reliable way to counter nuclear threats. In 80 years of the nuclear era, the only proven, demonstrated way to reduce the risk of nuclear conflict and to lessen the scale of its destruction is through diplomacy and negotiations. If not for past arms control agreements, Mr. Speaker, today's arsenals would be larger and more dangerous. If not for limitation on above-ground and atmospheric testing, many more people would suffer from radiation and contamination. But our challenge is made harder by the fact that there is only one arms control agreement remaining in force between the United States and Russia. The New START Treaty limits the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads for each party to 1,550. The treaty expires in February 2026. There are scant signs that either government is interested in extending it. President Donald Trump can and should take forward steps on nuclear arms control. He can follow in the footsteps of other Republican presidents. President Eisenhower, in his Atoms for Peace speech, expressed the moral imperative to warn Americans and the world of the destructiveness of atomic weapons. President Reagan, in his second term, negotiated the INF Treaty with the Soviets. He spoke privately with Gorbachev about the elimination of all nuclear weapons. Earlier this year, President Trump said from the Oval Office, and I quote, "There's no reason for us to be building brand new nuclear weapons. We already have so many. You could destroy the world 50 times over, 100 times over, and here we are building new nuclear weapons, and they're building nuclear weapons, end quote. He added, let me quote again, we're all spending a lot of money that we could be spending on other things that are actually, hopefully, more productive, end quote. On this point, Mr. Speaker, President Trump is right. President Trump has the opportunity to make nuclear threat reduction a part of his legacy. As a smart first step, he and Putin can strike a deal to respect New START's central limits and set the stage for a more comprehensive nuclear arms control framework agreement. Next, President Trump can put nuclear weapons on the agenda when he meets with Xi Jinping. He expressed a willingness to do this in his Oval Office comments. Even talking about negotiations in itself can help reduce tensions. A deal requires a first step, and I encourage the President to take it, and to take it soon. And we in Congress can use our voice. Along with our colleague, Representative Jill Takuda of Hawaii, I am the proud sponsor of HRES 317, a resolution that calls on the U.S. government to return to the negotiating table on nuclear disarmament and to lead a global effort to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. It reaffirms our country's moral and strategic obligation to prevent nuclear war and pursue a world free of nuclear weapons as a national security imperative. This call is in the spirit of President Eisenhower and Reagan, and Presidents Carter and Obama, and we hope President Trump. I'm pleased to report that Senators Markey, Merkley, Sanders, Welsh, and Van Hollen have all introduced a version of our resolution. And I urge the foreign policy committees of both bodies to consider these resolutions promptly. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, activity in House committees is taking us in the wrong direction. Last week, the Appropriations Committee approved an energy and water bill that cuts the National Nuclear Security Administration's Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation account by $412 million. That's 17%. These activities help the U.S. stop the spread of nuclear weapons, detect hidden nuclear activities, and support arms control efforts. Why would anybody think it is a good idea to cut that account? Also last week, the Armed Services Committee approved the National Defense Authorization Act. It authorizes $62 billion for the nuclear enterprise, which represents a 26% increase over President Biden's request last year. Unfortunately, the committee rejected an amendment by our colleague from California, John Garamendi, to restrict funding to create a new land-based nuclear delivery system, the Sentinel missile, a $180 billion boondoggle he has called an endless money pit. The threat of nuclear war is an existential one. We have a moral imperative to address it, and address it urgently. Debates over the utility and morality of nuclear weapons are as old as the nuclear age. Notably, many of the people who helped make atomic weapons turned out to be some of the most powerful voices against their use and for the reduction in their arsenals. 2 years ago this week, Mr. Speaker, the film Oppenheimer premiered. It told the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist who helped create the atomic bomb, but then pushed against development of more powerful weapons. And for that position of moral courage, he paid a political price. 2 months ago, Dr. Richard Gowan passed away at the age of 97. He's best known as the author of the first hydrogen bomb. Less widely known is that he spent decades working tirelessly in arms control and disarmament on scientific panels, conferences, and government boards. In a 2018 interview, Dr. Gowan said, and let me quote, "There is the myth, and you saw it operate many times in the past, that if there is a perceived security problem, well, no difficulty, we'll just buy more nuclear weapons. But that doesn't improve our security. What we want is less nuclear weapons and less cause for using them on the other side," end quote. You know, when I was a staffer for the late Congressman Joe Moakley in the 1980s, I recall going to hear Dr. Garwin and Dr. Carl Sagan give a talk on nuclear weapons and the Strategic Defense Initiative. Dr. Sagan, of course, is the physicist who helped us understand the idea of a nuclear winter, the hemisphere-wide dark age caused by the radioactive ash sent into the atmosphere following multiple nuclear detonations, wiping out food supplies, causing untold deaths from starvation, even beyond the millions killed by the blasts. For us today, the dynamic Dr. Garwin identifies isn't in the past, it's in the present. Our inboxes are full of policy papers expressing fears about the growth of China's nuclear arsenal, or Vladimir Putin's intentions, or Iran's plans. Too often, policymakers have a reflexive response. They are building more, so we should build more. Mr. Speaker, this is so short-sighted. It is a dangerous reaction, very, very dangerous. We know firsthand the harm that such devastating weapons can have. On the 80th anniversaries, people of many generations will gather in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and very few survivors of those atomic bombings remain with us. But their stories endure. The disturbing photos of the burns and the radiation sickness, they endure. In those cities, those gathered will recommit to preserving the memory of the destruction and to plead with current and future generations to work to ensure that such horrors never, ever, ever happen again. I regret I cannot be with them in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but that is why I have organized this special order on the House floor today, so that members can share their message from the floor of the House. And to our colleagues, and to the President, and to the American people, this is a crucial moment in world history. We have a moral responsibility to speak out and to do more. After the anniversaries, after the August break, when we return to Washington, let us commit to raise more awareness, more congressional hearings, more debate on the floor, more encouragement for scientists, civil society, and regular citizens to raise their voices. Let us commit to legislation to contain the growth of nuclear weapons. Let us commit ourselves to the elimination of nuclear weapons. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I am glad to yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative McGovern, for holding this special hour to discuss the dangers of nuclear weapons. You know, when I first entered Congress, I was the third PhD physicist elected to this body. We had at the time Vern Ehlers, a nuclear physicist and a conservative religious Republican representing Western Michigan. We had Rush Holt, a plasma fusion physicist, a progressive Democrat representing Princeton. And we had me, a sort of garden variety Democrat who spent the last 25 years smashing protons and antiprotons together to make particles that have not been around since the Big Bang. And although our politics were quite different, we were united by a special responsibility to join the discussion about nuclear weapons and ask what we can do to strengthen global nuclear security and maintain U.S. leadership in trying to prevent nuclear war. One area where we were always in violent agreement was to stop wasting money on Star Wars, which was then rebranded the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiatives, and is now rebranded Golden Dome. For more than 45 years, scientists have been patiently explaining to policymakers that this is never going to work. It is easy to overwhelm with a trivial response to it. We have spent over $200 billion on it. We have never tested it once against the kind of countermeasures that you know any competent opponent would deploy. And even if we succeed at stopping ballistic missiles, there are unfortunately many other ways to deliver nuclear weapons that we can never stop. And so this thing is deeply I guess stupid is not too strong a word. When you explain something to someone in a variety of terms again and again, and they just don't want to hear it because they think it messages so well, wouldn't it be great if we had this magic golden dome or whatever you want to call it, that would stop nuclear weapons? Yeah, it would be great, but if it is an impossibility due to the fundamental physics of it, then we should stop talking about it, and we should certainly stop wasting money on it. Another place where we were always in strong agreement was how we should be strengthening the non-proliferation efforts at our national laboratories. Our national labs create an underlying foundation for all of our nuclear security efforts, including the non-proliferation and national security priorities that we're talking about here today. In order to ensure that current and future arms control efforts are properly fulfilling their mission, we have to invest in our scientific workforce to maintain our leadership in verification efforts. You know, it's not well known, certainly among members of Congress, but when the IEA sends inspectors into Iran, into countries of concern, those have been largely trained by the national labs in the United States. And when we gut the non-proliferation capacities of our national labs, or simply allow them to retire, as has been happening, we risk putting aside one of the most powerful tools we have to actually enforce any deal that we may get. You know, the president's very fond of talking about this deal he's going to get on Iran nuclear. We listened to him talk about how he was going to get North Korea. You know, I support efforts to try doing that, but if we ever succeed at getting one of these deals, we are going to need, for sure, to have experts we trust that can go in there and make sure nobody's cheating. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is the gutting of those budgets and that capacity because it doesn't satisfy the MAGA worldview, I guess. And over the years, I've focused my attention on a few specific areas to strengthen our nuclear security architecture. One of them is what's called a nuclear. Well, it's the business. It has a number of names, but the question is, if for some reason a nuclear weapon is detonated somewhere in the United States or anywhere around the world, the president will come under huge pressure to say, who did that? Whose weapon was it? There is a lot of very detailed knowledge that we have had in the past in our national labs to be able to go in there, do what's called nuclear forensics, and find out whether that was a bomb from X, Y, or Z. And that capacity has been under duress for a long time, and it seems like it's every single time the appropriations budgets come up, we end up having to try to defend that. And that's something that's completely irrelevant until it's the most important question in the world. Who did that? Who let off this nuclear weapon? And how do we make sure we don't retaliate against the wrong person or entity that did that? So first, and there are a number of other things I've been working on. First and foremost is HRES 100. It's a resolution that I introduced in the House with 19 other members, supporting arms control and condemning Russia's purported suspension of its participation in the New START treaty. The current extension of the New START is set to expire in under a year, and anyone who remembers previous arms control negotiations will know that there's almost no time left to negotiate a subsequent treaty. Additionally, any negotiations, whether with Russia, China, or any other country, will require partners who are willing to have discussions on arms control, which is something that's far easier said than done. This is not something where the two great men leading great nations can come together and strike a deal. The details matter, and you have to have technical experts that you trust going deep down into the weeds to have an agreement that they will come back to you and say, yeah, this is a solid agreement that we can trust. And it's a time when traditional channels of dialogue on arms control and strategic stability have been closed or quiet, and we're going to rely more than ever on keeping alternative channels open and keeping the expertise in place so when the time comes for these agreements, we have people we trust that can carry them out. Non-governmental organizations, scientists, and research institutions have kept this dialogue open even during the worst parts of the Cold War, and we're going to need to rely on them to fulfill these roles again. Another crucial institution that we must continue to support in these times is the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. We're already seeing the incredibly hard work that Director General Grossi and his staff are putting in to responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine with its many nuclear reactors and the myriad of other crises on their doorstep. Which brings us to Iran. You know, one of the proudest moments in my career was standing alongside Dr. Richard Garwin, who, as Representative McGovern mentioned, often pointed to as the father of the hydrogen bomb, and a strong advocate for nuclear nonproliferation. He stood by my side along with Energy Secretary Dr. Ernie Moniz as I announced my support for the Iran nuclear deal. And one of the tragedies of the recent past has been this president's abandonment of the Iran nuclear deal, which has gotten us into a heck of a pickle. As predicted by the people who actually understood what our true options were in that negotiation. After the U.S. bombing of Iran, there's been an immense amount of debate about whether or not Iran's nuclear program was set back by a certain amount of time, whether it's years or whatever. But the level of technical ignorance that has been displayed by this administration is frankly frightening. They have access to the best weapons designers in the world, and either they're not listening to them or not asking their questions. Because when you hear Secretary Rubio, for example, saying, "Oh, don't worry about their 60% enriched uranium inventory because they're going to have to convert it to metal, and that will take us years." Anyone with a knowledge of the history of the Manhattan Project knows that is not a major activity. Iran has done it for a long time. They now know how to do it. And if you're only interested in converting from uranium hexafluoride to metal, a few tens of kilograms, which is what you need for your first weapon and set of weapons, this happens in a laboratory. It can happen in a congressional office. You don't need a big space for this. The conversion of the uranium hex to what's called green salt and the green salt to metal is something that happens in a small industrial building that can happen anywhere in any city in Iran and will be really hard to tell. So we have not prevented them from doing what they have to do. And the enrichment level is another thing where we're seeing, frankly, technically ignorant statements made. We have three levels of uranium. There's the less than 20% is generally regarded as relatively safe, can be used in reactors with without a lot of safeguards. Then when you get above 90% enriched uranium, that's the good stuff for really high performance weapons. But what about in between? They have 60% uranium. Guess what? That is not weapons grade, but it is weapons usable. For example, the Hiroshima bomb. The Hiroshima bomb was made with a mixture of 50% enriched uranium and higher enriched uranium. The 60% enriched uranium that Iran has a significant inventory of is perfectly usable even for a simple Hiroshima-style gun-type device. And when our leadership speaks in apparent ignorance of that fact, beating their chest and saying we set them back by decades, whereas in fact that's not the case. And this uranium hexafluoride, just to give you a sense of the scale, the 400 kilograms that the IEA watched them enrich to 60%, that is stored conventionally in the United States in about 25 scuba tank-sized pressurized containers. Any 5 of those scuba tanks have enough uranium to make a Hiroshima-style nuclear weapon. And these things are not hard to smuggle. We'll have a hard time convincing ourselves, in fact, that the Iranians already haven't done it. All right, and so just pretending like Iran does not have a credible threat here and has no leverage is a dangerous and ignorant position for our government to be taking, and one of the scariest things about the many threats that we face right now. For those of you who don't know, actually you should go look at the Wikipedia article on the Hiroshima little boy bomb. And you will see a lot of and the references in it. You know, it's unfortunately very well documented over the years because it's not the best weapon you can make by far. You can make much more complex and inefficient weapons, but the Iranians don't have to do that. If they simply want to replicate what was done, you get an old, 155 millimeter howitzer, you replace the explosive shell with some enriched, 60% enriched will work just fine. Uranium, you shoot it into the right shaped target, and you've got something that's as effective as the, as the Hiroshima weapon. You know, this is not a trivial risk, and the only answer to this is negotiations, and we have to get very serious about that. It's not something that the Iranians even have to test. We did not test the Hiroshima weapon before we sent it. It was just obviously going to work. The physics hasn't changed in the 80 years since then. And so we're at a very uncertain position on that, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. We've also recently been hearing a lot of calls about the resumption of nuclear testing. This is particularly worrying because the move away from nuclear testing has been really it's one of the cornerstone successes of non-proliferation and nuclear security. But just think of all the attention Donald Trump could get by giving the order that he wants to blow off a nuclear weapon just to make sure it works or whatever it is. You get a lot of attention that way. But our country has a tremendous amount to lose if everyone begins nuclear testing again. The U.S. during the Cold War conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests, far more than any other country, and we had much better instrumentation, knowing exactly what happened in those explosions. And that knowledge that we gained has allowed our nation to maintain the safety, security, and effectiveness of our nuclear stockpile without any further testing. And if we were to resume testing, the rest of the world would resume testing. I'm sure they all have bomb designers that are just chomping at the bit to get more data on exactly what happens if they explode one of their untested weapons. If we do this, we would be giving away the most significant strategic advantage that our country has, which is this huge database of exactly what works and what does not work in detailed and very technologically aggressive designs for our nuclear weapons. So if we open that Pandora box, every country which is nuclear capable will say this is our opportunity to become co-equal with the United States in knowledge of nuclear weapons, and that will be yet another disaster for the proliferation regime. So the next few years are going to be crucial to making sure that the world we live in remains safe from the threat of nuclear weapons. And again, I thank you, Representative McGovern, for bringing us together to discuss this. And
I thank the gentleman from Illinois for his thoughtful remarks. I now yield to the gentleman from Hawaii, Mr. Kuda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to join my colleagues and reinforce their warning and urgent call to action. Mr. Speaker, today we stand at a crossroads. The world is once again drifting toward a future where nuclear weapons are not just tools of deterrence, but urgent threats hanging over every human life. We cannot afford to look away, not when the lessons of the past are still very visible amongst us. Look to the people of the Marshall Islands, many of them living in my district, part of our Hawaii Ohana, whose lands became sacrifice zones in the name of power, entire communities displaced, generations scarred by radiation. The Bikini Atoll, once a paradise, became a proving ground for devastation. These were not just theoretical consequences, lines on paper, assumptions, equations. They were real, and they are very real still. The United States and its allies conducted 318 nuclear tests in the Pacific Islands. The people who lived on the islands lost their ancestral homes, now uninhabitable. And the people who were exposed to fallout were immediately sickened with ongoing long-term impacts for human health, including increased rates of birth defects, genetic disorders, and secondary cancers. The nuclear age taught us that while bombs may drop in seconds, their impacts stretch across centuries and generations. And now, instead of learning from history, learning from the mistakes of our past, we are poised to repeat it, with greater risk, fewer safeguards, and far more at stake. Today, the United States, Russia, and China inch closer to an unrestrained three-way arms race as we collectively spend well over $1 trillion on updated and new nuclear warheads and means of delivery. Just one of these programs, as was mentioned, the Sentinel Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, will cost $141 billion, according to the Department of Defense. But keep in mind, that's not even the bottom line. Their cost estimates keep growing and growing. A new arms race is a race with no finish line. Let us be clear. No winners, only losers in this race. And it doesn't have to be this way. We must urgently renew and expand nuclear arms control treaties with both Russia and with China. The path to security lies not in new warheads or golden domes, but in dialogue, transparency, and mutual restraint. We must invest as much into diplomacy and prevention as we do into silos and interceptors. Because let us be clear, all it takes is one bomb, one miscalculation, one moment of madness, and everything will end. The clock is ticking, but the future is still ours to shape. Let us choose wisdom over fear, peace over peril, life over annihilation. Mahalo to my colleague, Congressman McGovern, for organizing this special hour. And I would ask that on August 6th and August 9th, let us take a moment to pause. And remember, we do have a choice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman for her remarks. Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to once again call on the United States to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and for all of the world's nuclear-armed powers to adopt policies of mutual disarmament and abolition. In a few short weeks, we will mark the 80th anniversary of the only time nuclear weapons have been used in combat by the United States in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. The fact is, in 80 years since, we have only avoided nuclear war by sheer luck. As long as countries possess massive arsenals of world-destroying weapons, the risk of miscalculation and the risk of escalation is eternal. In the last few years, we have seen multiple situations that remind us of the extent of the fragility and of the danger. Nuclear-armed India exchanged fire with nuclear-armed Pakistan just this year. Cooler heads prevailed this time. Nuclear-armed Israel conducted unilateral strikes on facilities in Iran. That war didn't go nuclear this time. Nuclear-armed Russia continues its brutal war of conquest in Ukraine. We are avoiding escalations that increase the threats of nuclear threat war between Russia and the West so far. The truth is, the era of nuclear weapons will only end in one of two ways. Either we will abolish these horrific weapons from the face of the earth, or we will use them and abolish humanity instead. The only sane position, the only legitimate position for anyone who values human life is abolition. And more than half the countries in the world have now formally agreed, signing on to the TPNW. We should join them. Because just as we have gotten terrifyingly close to nuclear war in these past 80 years, we have gotten close to disarmament. It is not a pipe dream. Reagan, Gorbachev also did it. South Africa unilaterally dismantled their arsenal. Other countries have stopped developing nuclear weapons before they got the bomb. It is possible to disarm. It is possible to abolish nuclear weapons. We only need the political will, and we need the urgency. Finally, Mr. Speaker, you will note that I said the bomb dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the only nuclear weapons used in combat. But they were not. We must be absolutely clear the only times nuclear weapons have been used. In fact, nuclear weapons have been used thousands of times, and their primary targets have been Americans. We also mark this month the 80th anniversary of the Trinity test in New Mexico. And so we should remember that entire communities have been poisoned by these weapons right here in the United States. Entire generations have seen their families, their friends, their classmates dying of rare cancers caused by the radiation exposure. They have been forced to drink poisoned water and breathe poisoned air. The effect of the communities known as the downwinders have been catastrophic, and their suffering is still, sadly, mostly unknown in this country. We have made some small steps towards providing overdue compensation to these Americans, the first and the most consistent victims of our nuclear weapons program. But we still have a long way from justice. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Mr. McGovern for hosting this special hour tonight and for his years of principled leadership on this issue, and I yield back.
Speaker, I want to thank the gentlewoman for her remarks. And, we're living at a time when there's great polarization in our politics. But the issue that we're talking about here today ought to bring Democrats and Republicans together, because because Democrats and Republicans and liberals and conservatives, we do have a mutual interest in survival. And if nuclear weapons are ever used in current day, nobody wins. Nobody wins. And what we're talking about is the salvation or the destruction of our civilization from nuclear death. The stakes could not be higher. And yet what is shocking to many of us is the lack of urgency, the lack of attention to this subject. And I now, Mr. Speaker, would like to yield to the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib.
That's right. There is a lack of urgency. And we need to move with urgency because a nuclear war cannot be won and would have catastrophic human consequences. Our one warhead, has the power to wipe out an entire city. A full-scale nuclear war would devastate life as we know it. 80 years ago, the horrific U.S. bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki caused unimaginable death and immense human suffering, and survivors to this day face long-term health issues and radiation poisoning. So 80 years later, after these atrocities, we must, as a chamber here, recommit our efforts to finally achieving the complete and total abolition of nuclear weapons worldwide. We must ensure these war crimes are never repeated anywhere. Nuclear weapons are tools of death and destruction. They cannot be used without disastrous consequences that violate international law and our shared humanity. The White House and Congress need to immediately work to negotiate new constraints to cap and reduce nuclear arsenals, especially with Russia and China. We must do everything in our power to prevent an unrestrained nuclear arms race. It's absolutely terrifying that in the United States, the president has the power to unilaterally decide to launch a nuclear weapon. Think about that for one moment. The use of just a fraction of nuclear weapons we possess, most of which are ready to launch within minutes of an order from any president, including the current one, would lead to mass destruction of unprecedented global scale. Members of Congress on both sides of the aisle should back common sense efforts to prioritize nuclear disarmament and adopt measures to reduce the risk of nuclear war. We must continue to work towards international agreements, Mr. Chair, with all 9 countries that possess nuclear weapons through comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, as well as the treaty on prohibiting nuclear weapons. Again, we must come together. I cannot say this enough. The devastation, the consequences of any nuclear launch could be, again, life-changing around the world. We must continue to strive for a world free from the threat of nuclear war. With that, again, I cannot thank enough my colleague, Mr. McGovern, as he commits to banning nuclear weapons, and again, try to save us from any kind of life-changing devastation to our lives, to our world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank Congresswoman Tlaib, all my colleagues who have been here today, because this is the most important issue, quite frankly, facing our planet. Mr. Speaker, we can never ignore the fact that behind the conference room discussions about the utility of nuclear weapons, behind the corporate lobbying for nuclear modernization spending, this is a story of human suffering. The Nobel Committee awarded the 2024 Nobel Peace Prize to the organization Nihon Hidanko for its efforts to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons and for demonstrating through witness testimony that nuclear weapons must never be used again. Nihon Hidanko is a grassroots movement of atomic bomb survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 2 weeks, members of this organization, along with activists and citizens from Japan and around the world, will gather in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombings. They will amplify this clear and existential message that nuclear weapons must never, ever be used again. This organization keeps alive the testimony of Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They are the witnesses to the indescribable, the unthinkable, the incomprehensible pain and suffering caused by nuclear weapons. Nihon Hidanko highlights the nuclear taboo, the concept that nuclear weapons should never be used, an idea that is under threat from the growth in nuclear arsenals from around the world. Among the organization's aims is an international treaty for nuclear disarmament. Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, was adopted on July 7, 2017, and entered into force on January 22, 2021. It is the first legally binding international agreement to comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons, with the ultimate goal being their total elimination. 73 nations are party to the treaty. The United States is not. Neither are the other 8 nuclear powers. We won't get there overnight, but we should not abandon the goal. My resolution, along with the gentlewoman from Hawaii, Representative Takuda, HRES 317, calls for good faith negotiations with the other 8 nuclear-armed states to halt any further buildup of nuclear arsenals and to aggressively pursue a verifiable and irreversible agreement or agreements to verifiably reduce and eliminate their nuclear arsenals according to a negotiated timetable. I encourage my colleagues to support this resolution and join us in our efforts. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Thank you very much for yielding. My colleague, Ranking Member McGovern of the Rules Committee. I thank him and the CPC for organizing this very important special order hour. Next month marks 80 years since the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These were the only times that nuclear weapons have ever been used in war. I have to say that this memorial, this memory, this 80th anniversary milestone is not just historical, it is somewhat personal, and unexpectedly so, say beginning in 2001, 2002, when at the age of 41, I made my first visit to Japan. I grew up as an American, a Japanese American. One of my grandparents, the only grandparent, my grandfather Isao Takano, immigrated to the United States around 1916. He was born in 1898 in Japan, and he came from the environs of Hiroshima. Growing up, we would go to his niece, my second cousin, or one of my, I don't know how to appropriate the right sort of familial designations of who's a cousin, a second cousin, but Kikue Takagi was my grandfather's niece, who married an American and lived in Anaheim and worked at Disneyland. We knew that, we knew some facts, but we never in our times when we would get together for our family gatherings, would we ever discuss what happened in Hiroshima. But it wasn't until I was well into my adulthood on my first trip to Japan visiting Hiroshima and visiting Kikuwe, who was there taking care of her mother, that I learned that she was hibakusha, a survivor. That's a Japanese word for a survivor of the atom bomb. She lived in the outskirts of Hiroshima. If you've been there, it's mountainous. It's a place, a delta with 5 different rivers converging. And she lived in the outskirts. And she was a middle school student. And on the day that the bomb dropped, she was still ill, so much so that her mother said, "You don't need to go into the city center to do your public service work." Because the middle school children were needed to clean up the debris of the area around the downtown of Hiroshima. They were doing an urban renewal project to widen the streets. They knew, the people of Hiroshima, the political class knew that Hiroshima was a target because it was an industrial city. But little did they know that the teachers, the middle school teachers, and the 13-year-olds who were there at the city center doing this public service work were all going to perish that day. But my cousin survived because she stayed home at the behest of her mother. And she had not visited any of the memorials until I had arrived in the early 2000s. And I felt a tinge of guilt for asking her to do this because she had never really sort of delved into this history by visiting the Memorial Museum. Riding over the bridge of one of the rivers to the museum, the day that Kikuwe decided and I decided to go, she told me about how the river was not visible during the day that the bomb, and the days afterward, because of the numbers of bodies that just covered the surface of that water. And when you arrive at the memorial location, you can see bottles of water that many people who attend these memorials will leave for the thirsty souls of those who perished and those who were thirsty from the August heat. I feel a deep obligation and responsibility to carry this memory forward. And I remember as I crossed the bridge thinking to myself how I was personally connected by family to this historical event, that it was not something abstract. And it was a moment that who I was, my identity, somewhat shifted and changed. More than 200,000 people were killed. Most of them civilians, some died instantly, others suffered for months or years from burns, radiation, and grief. 80 years after the erasure of 2 cities, we have still not learned the lessons of these terrible bombings. There are an estimated 13,400 nuclear warheads on Earth today. The United States and Russia hold more than 90% of them. Together, we control more than 12,000 warheads, and that's more than enough to end human civilization. And while the United States and Russia maintain the largest stockpiles, China is rapidly building. According to the Department of Defense, China's arsenal already has 500 operational warheads. And if current trends continue, it could surpass 1,000 by the year 2030. This growth adds to global instability and makes the case for urgent diplomacy and arms control. It makes the case even stronger for diplomacy and arms control. And yet, the most important arms control treaty still in force between the United States and Russia is set to expire in less than 200 days. If we let the New START treaty expire, we will be left with no legal limits on the size of the 2 largest nuclear arsenals in the world. And at the same time, we are seeing headlines about strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. These actions revive a dangerous question. Can we stop the spread of nuclear weapons through military force? I believe the answer is no. We cannot destroy knowledge with a bomb. We cannot erase a nuclear program by targeting one facility. Strikes might delay a program, but they almost always provoke retaliation and harden resolve. And they do nothing to build the kind of long-term trust and transparency that actually reduces nuclear risk. That is why we need a strategy based on diplomacy, prevention, and protection. We know that this strategy can work because it did in the past. Iran's nuclear weapons program development ground to a halt under the Iran nuclear deal. It was only after President Trump ripped up the accord that Iran set itself on the pathway it is on today. And the recent strikes reinforce the military theocracy's paranoia that the only pathway to secure the regime's long-term survival is through development of a nuclear program. Because, like I said before, if a nation has enough willpower and know-how, they will develop a nuclear weapon. And that means U.S. national security cannot solely rest on deterrence. We should lead by example. That means modernizing verification tools, supporting international inspectors, and investing in the diplomatic capacity to negotiate real agreements. It also means rethinking how we can make decisions about the use of nuclear weapons. And Congress has a role to play. We cannot stay silent while the risks grow and the guardrails fall away. The American people deserve transparency about how nuclear launch decisions are made and who is involved in making them. This is not just a matter of policy, it is a matter of survival. Mr. Speaker, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not mere tragedies. They were warnings. The people who died there cannot speak for themselves, but we can speak for the future they were denied. We can choose a path that avoids repeating the worst mistake in human history. Let us honor the lives lost not only with remembrance but responsibility. Let's choose diplomacy over destruction, prevention over provocation, and peace over peril. And let me return back to that scene of riding over that bridge over the river with my cousin Kikue, and the thought that I had that every world leader who has some control over a nuclear arsenal should make it a commitment to visit Hiroshima and walk the grounds and understand what happened there, what happened in Nagasaki, because I think that's the only way that one has the moral stature and authority to be a leader of a country that has a nuclear arsenal. Thank you very much, and Mr. Speaker, and I yield back to my good friend, Mr. McGovern.
And Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for his eloquent remarks, and there's so much more that needs to be said, but our time is coming to a close, so let me end by saying the following. You know, when I was in college in the late 1970s, I interned for Senator George McGovern, no relation, but a leader on arms control issues. And I was able to accompany him to a debate with William F. Buckley at Yale University entitled "Resolve that the SALT talks are in the interest of U.S. national security." And of course, by that, the SALT talks were the strategic arms limitation talks. And George McGovern closed the debate, and I remember this like it was yesterday, but I thought very powerfully. He said that he recalls that when he was a young senator in 1963, they were debating the limited nuclear test ban agreement. And Senator Everett Dirksen, who was the Republican Senate minority leader at the time, took to the floor to close the debate. And he had said that he had just reread John Hersey's Hiroshima, the description of what happened to that great city the morning after. The scene of one family sitting charred around the breakfast table. Out in the yard, bits and pieces of children's clothing. The broken arm of a doll. Toys and debris scattered over the landscape. And he said, you know, I thought about that scene, and I said, someday Everett Dirksen will be buried in Illinois. And when that happens, I don't want them to put on my gravestone, he knew about this and he didn't care. Well, Mr. Speaker, we all know the realities of nuclear weapons and their devastation, and the fact that if they were ever used, it will result in the total annihilation of our planet. The question for all of us is, are we going to do anything about it? You know, I said earlier that one of the most troubling factors in this whole topic is the lack of urgency here in Congress. I mean, we don't talk about this. We're not pushing for arms control. We're not setting goals of the total abolition of nuclear weapons. Instead, we are just, out of habit, voting in favor of military budgets that contribute to the problem. And I think at this moment, as we approach the 80th anniversaries of these horrible events, this is a time for us to step up and to do something before it's too late. And so I urge my colleagues to commemorate, to have moments of silence to remind their constituencies of the anniversaries of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I urge them to join with us in a bipartisan way in doing something about it. George McGovern ended his debate with William Buckley at Yale by saying this. He said, "Many years ago, in ancient wisdom, it was said, 'I have set before you two choices, life or death. Therefore choose life, that thee and thy seed may live.'" And that's the choice I want the United States to make at this moment. And I hope that we are up to the task, and I hope that we just don't continue to ignore the perils of nuclear warfare. And with that, I yield back my time.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2025, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I'm going to yield to my friend from California as much time as he may consume.
Thank you very much to my friend from Arizona. Mr. Speaker, in 2010, California voters overwhelmingly voted to establish a citizens redistricting commission. Politicians shouldn't choose their voters. And that